My name is Emma. I am 35 years old, and this is the story I never thought I would tell out loud. It begins on a Friday afternoon that looked like any other. But the moment I stepped into the director's office, the air shifted. David Langston leaned back in his polished leather chair, his voice eerily calm as he asked, "How long have you been with us, Emma?" I swallowed hard. 29 years. And 362 days. He smirked, slid a manila folder across the desk, and dropped the bomb. "Due to budget constraints, we are letting you go, effective immediately." The words crashed over me like a tidal wave. I had given my entire adult life to this company, late nights, combing through reports, weekends, sacrificed family moments, stolen, all because I believed in stability, in the promise of security when I finally retired. In 3 days, just 3, my pension would have vested. The finish line was right there. And now, with a few words and a folder, everything I had worked for was being ripped away. I should have screamed. I should have begged. But instead, a strange calm wrapped itself around me. Years of compliance work had trained me to see patterns. And the pattern here was undeniable. This was not about budgets. This was about cutting me off before I could claim what was rightfully mine. I picked up the folder without opening it. "Thank you for the opportunity," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the storm inside me. David's eyes flickered with surprise. Perhaps he expected tears. Perhaps he wanted me broken. But I would not give him that satisfaction. Janet from HR escorted me back to my office, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously toward the security guard waiting by the door. "I'm so sorry, Emma," she whispered. "This isn't right." Right, no. But it was clear. The company wanted me gone before I could collect what I had earned over 3 decades. I packed my life into a single cardboard box, my late husband's photo, the small plant my daughter had given me when she left for college, the plaque they handed me for 25 years of service. That was all. That was how nearly 3 decades ended, with silence, a box, and a guard holding open the lobby door. As I stepped out into the cold April rain, I realized something. They thought they had silenced me. They thought a manila folder could erase 29 years. But what they did not know, what David Langston could never have guessed, was that I had been preparing for this moment all along. For 4 years, I had been documenting irregularities, numbers that did not add up, reports that were backdated, financial statements too glossy to be real. My instincts told me something rotten was growing inside the company. And so piece by piece, I had built my own insurance policy. That folder David handed me, it was supposed to be the end of my story. But in truth, it was only the beginning. I drove home through the rain, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than I realized. Every street I passed carried a memory of what I had sacrificed for that company. Missed recitals, shortened vacations, dinners, eaten cold at midnight. 29 years of loyalty, and now all of it had been reduced to a manila folder and a cardboard box. Inside my kitchen, I placed the box on the table. I stared at it for a long time, my tea growing cold as the reality settled in. David thought he had ended me. He thought by firing me on this exact Friday, 3 days before my pension vested, he had saved the company money and buried my future. But what he did not know was that I had already seen this coming. My whole career had been about spotting irregularities, noticing the things others ignored. And everything about David Langston had screamed irregular. I opened the severance package, 3 months' pay in exchange for my silence. No pension, no health coverage, just a gag order disguised as a contract. I almost laughed. Did they think I would be desperate enough to sell away 3 decades of work for a few months of quiet? No. I remembered my husband Thomas telling me years ago, "Emma, your attention to detail is not a quirk. It is your shield." He was right. Every memo I filed, every discrepancy I noted, every piece of evidence I had quietly copied and taken home, they were all part of that shield. For years, the executives had brushed me aside. But now, the moment they tried to erase me, I finally understood what all those files meant. They were not just records, they were power. I closed the severance folder and set it aside. My heart slowed. My fear turned into clarity. I had a choice: sign their papers, vanish quietly, and let them rob me of what I had earned, or fight. Fighting meant risk. Fighting meant stepping into the light where people like me usually get crushed. But what choice did I have left? They had already taken everything. I whispered into the quiet kitchen. "You picked the wrong person, David." The phone rang. Janet from HR. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. David himself. His voice on the recording was sharper now. "Emma, it's imperative you sign those documents. If you don't, your severance will be in jeopardy." The tone was controlled panic. He was not as confident as he seemed, and that was when I realized they were not afraid of losing money. They were afraid of me. I walked down the hall to the small study where I kept a fireproof lockbox. My hand shook as I pulled it out from under the shelves, but when I turned the key and lifted the lid, a calmness returned. Inside were years of work, thousands of pages, emails, falsified reports, instructions to backdate certifications, even loan documents that never should have been approved. I had kept it all, telling myself it was only precaution. Now it was survival. As I sifted through the papers, I thought about everything I had endured. They had stolen my time, they had disrespected my work, and now they thought they could steal my retirement. But the evidence in this box said otherwise. I knew who to call. Gregory Santos, former chief financial officer of the company, now an official with the Securities and Exchange Commission. A man who had once told me, "Emma, you are the most meticulous officer I've ever worked with. Never lose that." I picked up my phone. My finger hovered over his name. For a moment, doubt whispered. Was I ready to become a whistleblower, to stand against a machine that crushed people like me without hesitation? But then I remembered David's smirk, his casual cruelty, and the way the guard had held the door open as if I were already a ghost. No, I would not disappear. I pressed call. The line rang. Gregory answered. And in that moment, I knew this was not the end of my story. This was the start of a war. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to pause here. Because I know many of you watching have felt that same moment when someone tried to erase years of your effort with one cruel decision. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. Because trust me, what came next shocked even me. The night after I called Gregory, I sat awake until nearly sunrise. My mind drifted through the past 29 years, unspooling like a film reel I could not turn off. Each memory carried the weight of sacrifice, and each sacrifice had been made for the company that had just betrayed me. I remembered the first time I stayed late, long after everyone else had gone home. My daughter had been only 7 then. She had called me from the kitchen phone, her small voice asking, "Mom, are you still at work?" I told her I would be home soon, but it was nearly midnight when I finally walked through the door. She was asleep on the couch, her homework scattered across her lap. That image has never left me. It wasn't just one night. It was years. Missed recitals, soccer games I promised I would attend but didn't. Vacations cut short because a compliance emergency demanded my presence. I built my career on the belief that if I worked hard enough, if I kept the company honest, I would be rewarded with stability, with a pension that would carry me through the years when I could finally rest. I gave them my loyalty. They repaid me with silence and betrayal. But there was another side to those sacrifices too. For every recital I missed, I wrote another report that kept the company from breaking the law. For every late-night audit, I uncovered another irregularity that someone else would have ignored. I had thought my diligence would protect the company. Now I realized it had been protecting me, because without those files, without my meticulous notes, I would be defenseless. Gregory's words from our call still echoed in my mind. He had listened to me for nearly 2 hours, his tone steady, professional, but charged with something else: urgency. He told me what I already suspected: this wasn't just wrongful termination. This was securities fraud. Emma, he said, what you're describing could bring the company down. But it will also expose you to everything they'll throw at you. They will try to discredit you. They will try to make you disappear. But the law is on your side if you're willing to fight. I looked again at the box of files on my desk. Every page was a reminder of the life I had lived, one defined by sacrifice, by detail, by a refusal to look away when others did. My late husband used to tell me, "Your stubbornness is your strength." Perhaps he had been right. The next morning, I began organizing. It was almost comforting the way each document found its place in the timeline I created. Loan applications falsified in 2018, quarterly reports manipulated in 2020, emails instructing staff to backdate certifications as recently as last quarter. I built 3 sets of everything, one for the SEC, one for my lawyer, and one locked away for myself. As I worked, my phone buzzed constantly, messages from Janet, from David, even from the company's general counsel. Their tone shifted with each voicemail from polite to insistent to downright threatening. Failure to comply could jeopardize your severance entirely, one voice snapped. Another warned that refusing to sign would close every door for me in the industry. But those messages only fueled me. They confirmed what I already knew. They were afraid of me, afraid of what I had kept. I paused for a moment and looked at a photo on my desk, my daughter on the day she graduated high school, her smile wide, her cap slightly crooked. I had missed so many of her moments. And for what? For a company that thought they could erase me 3 days before my pension. No, this time I would not back down. Sometimes when I tell people this part of the story, they ask me if I regret giving so much of my life to that job. The truth is complicated. I regret the moments I lost. But I do not regret the discipline it taught me, the instincts that kept me gathering files, the stubbornness that made me resist shortcuts. Those very things were about to become my salvation. Now I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, 29 years invested and 3 days away from the finish line, what would you have done? Would you have signed the papers and walked away, or would you have fought back? Leave me your thoughts in the comments, because I know so many of you have been tested in your own lives. That weekend, as the rain kept falling and my phone kept ringing, I stayed focused on one thought. They thought I was finished. They thought they could steal my pension, my security, my dignity. But they had underestimated the one thing I had always relied on, my refusal to look away. And that refusal was about to change everything. The rain had not stopped for 2 days, and it felt fitting. Every drop on my window reminded me of the years I had spent uncovering what others chose to ignore. My mind wandered back through the trail of irregularities. I had chased clues scattered across reports and spreadsheets that most people skimmed past. I had always seen them. I had always written them down. It started 4 years earlier. A quarterly report landed on my desk that did not match the shipment logs. The numbers were too perfect, too polished. I remember circling the figures in red ink, my stomach tightening with that familiar feeling something was wrong. When I brought it up in a meeting, the response was casual, dismissive. "Emma, you're overanalyzing. Let's not get stuck on technicalities." But I knew the difference between technicalities and fraud. After that, I started keeping copies. I told myself it was just precaution, that someday I might need to show a full picture of what was happening. Each year, the stack grew taller, loan applications with signatures that looked suspicious, revenue sheets showing growth that our actual sales could never support, emails instructing managers to adjust dates to fit a narrative. None of it was small. None of it was harmless. And then David Langston arrived. From the moment he stepped into the company, I could feel his presence like a cold draft in the room. His reputation preceded him. Streamlining operations was how they described it. But I had seen what those words meant in practice: cut corners, bend the rules, ignore the law if it interfered with profits. Within 6 months, the pace of irregularities doubled. Reports came across my desk with numbers so inflated I almost laughed. Almost. I remember one particular memo. A directive from David's office instructed staff to backdate quality control certifications. The products had already shipped, but the paperwork would make it appear as if everything had been properly inspected. I refused to sign off. I wrote a report, filed it up the chain, and waited for someone to respond. Days passed, Weeks. Finally, a reply came back. Focus on more pressing matters. The words felt like a slap. That was the moment I realized the system inside the company was broken. Compliance was supposed to be the safeguard, the line no one could cross. But when the very people in power dismissed my findings, the line disappeared. Everywhere I looked, the pattern repeated. Revenue manipulation, loans approved under false pretenses, shareholder reports doctored to look more promising than reality. Each time I flagged an issue, it was buried. Each time I sent an email, it vanished into silence. The weight of it pressed on me in ways I cannot describe. I knew what it meant if anyone outside discovered the truth. This was not just bending rules, this was systematic fraud. It could ruin lives, wipe out savings, shake the trust of thousands of employees who, like me, believed in the company's stability. Yet no one wanted to listen. Sometimes late at night, I would sit at my desk with my notes spread around me, wondering if I was the only one who cared. But then I would look at Thomas's picture. My husband had always told me, never let them change who you are. And I could not. I would not. That is why each time I copied the files and slid them into the fireproof lockbox at home. Quietly, methodically, like a soldier preparing for a battle that no one else believed was coming. Now, holding those same files in my hands, I understood what David had done. Firing me 3 days before my pension vested was not just cruelty, it was strategy. He had to get rid of me before I could expose what I knew. He believed my silence could be bought with 3 months of severance. He believed I was just another aging employee too tired to fight. But he never understood the years of notes, the trail of evidence, the stubbornness that had defined my career. I looked again at the memos, the signatures, the backdated reports. Each page carried a story, a piece of truth that they had tried to bury. And in that moment, I made a silent promise. I would not let those truths die in a box. The company had ignored me for years, but the world would not. The lockbox sat heavy on my desk, its metal surface cold under my fingertips. Inside it were not just papers, but years of my life, thousands of pages I had carefully, almost obsessively saved. Most people collect photo albums or scrapbooks. I had collected evidence. I had not realized it at the time, but those stacks of files were my lifeline, the only shield I had left against a company that had decided to erase me. I opened the lid and spread the contents across the desk. Loan applications with numbers that never should have passed approval. Quarterly reports manipulated so aggressively that the truth was buried under layers of false growth. Emails instructing staff to falsify inspection dates. And all of it connected back to the same web of deceit. As I flipped through the documents, I thought about why I had done this. For years, my colleagues had laughed at my habits. Emma, you keep too much. You make copies of everything. You're paranoid. Maybe I was. Or maybe I had simply learned the truth too early. Systems fail. People look away, and paper, real paper, becomes the only thing that speaks when everyone else is silent. I stacked the files into neat piles, labeling them carefully. One set for the Securities and Exchange Commission, one for my attorney, and one to remain here locked away in case both of those vanished. My late husband Thomas would have teased me for being so methodical, but he also would have understood. He had always said my stubbornness was a kind of strength. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled. For the first time in days, the fear began to fade, replaced by something sharper clarity. The company thought they had ended my story. What they had really done was trigger the beginning of theirs. They had no idea that by forcing me out, they had unleashed everything I had been quietly holding in reserve. My phone buzzed again, vibrating across the desk. David's number. I ignored it. Moments later, another call came, this time from Janet in HR, then the company's general counsel. Each voicemail was more desperate than the last. They wanted me to sign the papers to agree to silence. And the more they pushed, the more obvious it became. They knew exactly how dangerous I could be. I stared at the files again. Each page was proof. Proof of the lies, proof of the fraud, proof that my career had never been meaningless. I had built this archive piece by piece, thinking it was just for my own sanity. But now it had become my weapon. It struck me then that this was no longer just about me. It was not only about my pension or my dignity or even the 30 years they had stolen from me. It was about the truth, about every employee still inside that building who believed the numbers they were being fed, about the shareholders trusting reports that were fabrications, about my daughter who had watched me miss milestones because I believed in doing the right thing. I stood up, pushed the files into their folders, and locked the box again. I felt lighter, steadier. The fear was still there, but it no longer owned me. For once, I owned it. And I realized something else. There are moments in life when silence is betrayal. And I would not betray myself or the truth by staying quiet. Before I tell you about the step that changed everything, let me pause. If you've ever felt the weight of being silenced, of being told your work or your voice didn't matter, then you understand what I faced. If you believe stories like this should never be buried, make sure you subscribe now and be part of this community. Together, we prove that silence is never the answer. I closed my eyes and placed my hand on the lockbox one final time. Then I whispered to the empty room, "They have no idea what's coming." Because now the war was no longer about a pension. It was about exposing everything they had tried to hide, and I was ready. The rain had quieted by Saturday morning, but the silence inside my house felt heavier than the storm outside. I sat at the kitchen table with the lockbox beside me, a fortress of truth in cold steel. The phone lay face down on the table, but I could still hear David's voice from the last voicemail echoing in my head. "Emma, this is your final chance. Sign the papers, and we can all move on." Move on. After 29 years of loyalty, after being pushed out like trash, after discovering fraud buried under mountains of numbers, they thought I would just move on. I turned the phone over. My contact list scrolled beneath my thumb until I stopped on a name I hadn't spoken in years, Gregory Santos. Gregory had once been the company's chief financial officer back before David arrived. He had always treated me with respect, even when others dismissed me as overly cautious. Years ago, during a tense meeting, I had presented a lengthy compliance report that everyone else wanted to gloss over. Gregory had leaned back, studied me, and said, "Emma, your diligence is inconvenient for them, but invaluable to me." It was one of the few times I had felt truly seen. He left the company not long after moving to Washington to work for the Securities and Exchange Commission. I had congratulated him, but deep down, I felt his absence like a loss. Without Gregory, my reports began disappearing faster, my concerns buried deeper. And now years later, I was staring at his name again, my finger hovering over the call button. Doubt whispered in my mind. If I reached out, there would be no turning back. I would be crossing from quiet employee to whistleblower, from internal reports to federal investigations. It could consume my life. It could ruin my reputation. They would call me bitter, disloyal, even crazy. But then I pictured David's smirk as he slid the severance folder across the desk, the arrogance in his voice when he said effective immediately. And suddenly, the choice wasn't a choice at all. I pressed the call button. Emma Gregory's voice came through warm, yet cautious. "Gregory," I breathed, the weight of the last 24 hours pressing against me. "I need your help." There was a pause, the kind that told me he already understood more than I had said. "Tell me everything," he replied. For nearly 2 hours I spoke. I told him about the files in my lockbox, the years of manipulated numbers. The memos ignored the orders to backdate certifications. I told him about David's arrival and the sudden acceleration of fraud. And finally, I told him about my termination 3 days before my pension vested. Gregory listened without interruption. When I finished, there was a silence so long I thought the line had dropped. Then his voice came steady and low. "Emma, this isn't just wrongful termination. This is a serious securities violation. From what you're describing, the company could be facing massive penalties. And the timing of your firing that only strengthens your case." My throat tightened. "So what do I do?" "You don't sign anything," he said firmly. "Not one paper. And you make sure those documents are secured. I'll arrange a meeting with our team on Monday morning. Once you hand this over, an official investigation begins. But Emma, there's no turning back after this. Are you ready?" Was I ready? I looked at the lockbox, at the piles of evidence I had guarded for years. I thought of my daughter, the life I wanted for her, the example I needed to set. I thought of my husband, who had always told me to stand firm in my principles. And I thought of the hollow look in David's eyes when he realized I hadn't cried, hadn't begged, hadn't broken. "Yes," I whispered, "I'm ready," good Gregory said. "Then on Monday everything changes." When the call ended, I sat back, my heart pounding. For the first time since David had ended my career, I felt something that had been missing for too long. Hope. Not the fragile hope of waiting for a pension check, but the fierce hope that comes when you know the truth is finally going to matter. I closed the lockbox and placed it back on the shelf, but this time I did it with a sense of purpose. I was no longer just a woman discarded by her company. I was a witness, I was a fighter, and I was not alone anymore. Sunday morning dawned gray and damp, the kind of morning that begged me to stay in bed. But there was no time for rest. I had less than 24 hours before my meeting with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And if Gregory was right, if everything I held in that lockbox really was the kind of evidence that could topple a company, then I needed to be ready. I carried the box into my study and began pulling out the files. The desk soon disappeared beneath layers of paper, each stack representing a different kind of misconduct. Loan applications falsified to secure money the company should never have received. Internal emails directing managers to alter shipment records. Quarterly reports rewritten to make revenues look 18% higher than they really were. I organized the files chronologically, labeling them with sticky notes. Then I cross-referenced them with the memos I had sent over the years, the ones that had been ignored, dismissed, or outright buried. For every manipulated figure, I had the corresponding warning. For every suspicious loan, I had the email thread that explained it away. The evidence did not just tell a story, it screamed it. By noon, I had built 3 complete sets of documents, one for Gregory and the SEC team, one for my attorney who I had already contacted to join me at Monday's meeting, and one for myself, sealed and hidden in a place only I knew: insurance. The phone rang constantly throughout the day. Janet's voice cracked with worry in one message. "Emma, I don't know what's going on, but the executives are in a panic. Please call me back." Then came David, his tone clipped urgent. "We need that paperwork signed today. I can come by to pick it up if that helps." By late afternoon, even the company's legal counsel had called his message sharp and threatening. Failure to comply could jeopardize your severance entirely. Their desperation told me everything I needed to know. They were not trying to save me, they were trying to save themselves. As I worked, I thought about the years that had led to this point, the nights spent hunched over my desk, my eyes burning from reviewing documents no one else had the patience to read. The holidays I had cut short to respond to urgent matters. The times I had been mocked for being too rigid, for caring too much about the rules. Every sacrifice, every dismissal, every insult, it all added up to this moment. I paused to take a photo from the shelf. It was my daughter Elizabeth on the day she graduated from college. I remembered sitting in the crowd, clapping harder than anyone else, tears streaming down my face. That day she had whispered to me, "Mom, everything you've given up, it was worth it. You taught me what strength looks like." I thought of her now. How could I teach her strength if I signed away my silence? How could I tell her to stand tall if I cowered? So I pressed on, stacking the files into neat boxes, creating an index to guide the investigators through every detail. With each folder sealed, I felt a little lighter. My fear turned into something sharper: resolve. Still, the weight of what I was doing was undeniable. By Monday morning, I would no longer just be Emma Reynolds' compliance officer. I would be a whistleblower, a target. The company would unleash everything it had to discredit me. They would drag my name, twist my motives, call me bitter or incompetent. But I had to remind myself of something: the truth does not change because people lie about it. The evidence would speak louder than their smears. As dusk fell, I carried the boxes to my car and locked them in the trunk. I wanted to be ready the moment I pulled out of the driveway for that meeting. I checked the locks on my doors twice before heading to bed. Sleep came fitfully, but with every hour that passed, my determination grew stronger. Now I want to ask you something. If you had thousands of pages proving a crime, but also knew exposing it would cost you your privacy, your reputation, maybe even your safety, would you do it? Or would you stay quiet and protect yourself? Tell me in the comments. I want to know how you see it. As I lay in the dark listening to the rain return against my window, I whispered the same words I had said the day David tried to erase me. They picked the wrong person, and tomorrow they would finally understand why. Sunday evening slid into night, and with it came a new level of pressure. It was as if the entire company had suddenly realized the mistake they had made by firing me, and now they were desperate to shove me back into silence before Monday arrived. The first knock came at my door just after dusk. I froze, my hand tightening around the lockbox that I had set back on the table. Through the peephole, I saw him, David Langston, dressed in his expensive suit, looking completely out of place in my modest neighborhood. My heart thudded. "Emma, I know you're in there." He called, his voice sharper now, stripped of the false calm he always wore at the office. "This is ridiculous. Just sign the papers and we can all move on." I stood perfectly still, my breath held tight in my chest. I didn't answer. I let him speak into the night, let his words fall flat against the wood of my door. After several minutes, he slid an envelope into my mailbox and stormed back to his car. I didn't retrieve it until his headlights disappeared. Inside was yet another copy of the severance agreement, this one scrawled with a handwritten note, "Final opportunity." Signed by 9 a.m., Monday. It almost made me laugh. They had reduced me after nearly 3 decades of service to a deadline scribbled on the back of a threat. The phone started again. Janet's number flashed across the screen. Then the company's general counsel. Then David once more. I let every call go to voicemail. Later, when I listened back, the pattern was clear. Janet's tone was broken, fearful. "Emma, please, I don't know what's going on, but you're in danger. Just be careful." The counsel's message was cold, almost cruel. "Failure to cooperate will result in forfeiture of all severance. We will pursue every legal remedy available." And David sounded frantic now. "Emma, you're making a mistake. Think about your future. Think about your daughter." My daughter. They had the audacity to invoke her name as if I hadn't already spent years sacrificing for her security, as if they hadn't tried to rob me of the very pension that would allow me to provide for her. The anger that surged in me was steady, not wild, a controlled burn. They were panicking, and their panic told me I was closer to the truth than they ever wanted me to be. I walked into my study and stared again at the 3 boxes of documents I had prepared earlier. Evidence that could not be ignored. Each page was a reminder that they had underestimated me for too long. They thought I was just an aging employee who would sign whatever they put in front of me. But I had played this game far longer than David had been at the company. I had learned patience, discipline, endurance. The hours crawled forward. At one point, the house phone rang, an old landline I rarely used anymore. When I answered, a voice I didn't recognize hissed, "Stop this before you ruin yourself." Then the line went dead. My hand trembled as I hung up the receiver, but I didn't cry. I didn't even shout. I simply wrote the words on a notepad, recorded the time, and added the note to my files. Evidence. Everything could be evidence. By midnight, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had long gone cold. My eyes burned with exhaustion, but I knew sleep would not come. Instead, I replayed Gregory's words in my mind. "This isn't just wrongful termination. This is fraud, and the law is on your side." The pressure from David and his allies was suffocating, but it also confirmed something important. They were terrified of what I knew. They wouldn't be pounding on my door, calling every hour, or slipping threats into my mailbox if they weren't. They wanted me quiet, desperate for me to fold, but I wasn't folding. I glanced once more at the envelope David had left outside. Then I fed it into the shredder. The sound was loud in the stillness of the night, almost cathartic as the paper broke into strips. "Final opportunity," he had written. He was right about that, but it wasn't mine, it was his. Because come Monday morning, the opportunity to bury the truth would be gone. I rose, locked the doors, and checked the window latches one final time. Then I sat back down at the desk, placed my hand on the lockbox, and whispered into the silence of my home. You tried to scare me, David, but you only reminded me why I can't be silent anymore. The clock ticked toward dawn each minute, pulling me closer to the moment that would change everything. Not just for me, but for every person still inside that company who deserved to know the truth. Monday morning arrived like a hammer striking steel. I had slept only 2 hours, but when the alarm rang at 6, I was already awake, already dressed in the navy suit I reserved for moments that mattered. This wasn't just another work day. It was the day I stepped out of silence and into battle. The boxes of documents sat ready in my trunk, each folder neatly organized, each page telling a story of deceit. As I drove downtown past the cathedral where my husband and I had once exchanged vows, past the school where my daughter had graduated, I thought about how much of my life had been tied to this city, to this company. And now, in the heart of it, I was about to expose the lies that had poisoned everything. The Securities and Exchange Commission office loomed ahead, glass and steel understated, yet imposing. Inside, Gregory was waiting for me in the lobby. His hair was grayer than I remembered his face, lined with years, but his eyes still carried the sharp intelligence I had always trusted. "Emma," he said warmly, shaking my hand. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." "It's good to see you," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "Thank you for taking this seriously." He led me to a conference room where 2 others were waiting. Angela Brennan, a senior enforcement attorney, and James Weston, a forensic accountant. They greeted me politely, but their expressions were serious. Angela leaned forward, her tone calm but deliberate. "Mrs. Reynolds, once you share this information with us, an official investigation begins. There's no turning back. Do you understand?" I nodded, completely. For the next 3 hours, I walked them through everything. I laid out the manipulated reports, the backdated certifications, the fraudulent loan applications. James examined the spreadsheets, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. "These discrepancies aren't small," he finally said. "The company has been overstating revenue by at least 18% for the past 2 years. That's securities fraud." Angela asked question after question. "You reported these issues internally." Every time I answered, sliding copies of memos and emails across the table. Each one was ignored, or buried, or rerouted to David Langston's office where they disappeared. "And you believe your termination was connected to these reports?" "Without question," I said. "They fired me 3 days before my pension vested. That was calculated." But more than that, I had just flagged major issues with David's latest cost-cutting initiative. He needed me gone before I could escalate further. Gregory leaned back, his gaze steady. "This is bigger than one executive, Emma. From what you've shown us, the company has been manipulating its financials for years. Langston accelerated it, but he didn't start it." The weight of his words settled over me. I had always suspected the rot went deeper, but hearing it confirmed made my chest tighten. When the meeting ended, Angela outlined the next steps. "We'll need your formal statement. We'll begin our investigation immediately. It usually takes time before enforcement action is considered, but given the scale of what you've shown us, we may move quickly." As I walked out of the federal building, the spring air felt colder than the lobby I had just left. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Janet's voice trembled on the voicemail. "Emma, something's happening. The board just called an emergency meeting. David's locked in his office, and there are rumors about SEC investigators contacting our legal counsel." I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, the city moving around me, the weight of what had begun pressing against my ribs. The first stone had been thrown into the water, and the ripples were already spreading. That night I sat in my living room staring at the phone as it lit up again and again. Calls from executives from numbers I didn't recognize, even from the chairman of the board himself. I didn't answer, not yet, because I knew something they didn't. I had only revealed the beginning. The real storm was still coming. And you will not believe what happened when the board tried to bring me back into their circle. Make sure you stay with me, because the next part will show just how far people in power will go when their empire begins to crumble. By Tuesday morning, the first tremors had already turned into aftershocks. News spread faster than I could have imagined. Local business journals ran headlines about an unconfirmed SEC investigation into my former company, and within hours those headlines were everywhere. Traders, analysts, even ordinary employees scrolling their phones over coffee, everyone was talking about it. The company's stock began to tumble before noon. At first, it was only a few percentage points, the kind of dip that could be brushed off. But by mid-afternoon, the fall accelerated. Investors smelled fear, and fear spreads quicker than truth. By the closing bell, nearly 15% of the company's value had evaporated. My phone rang nonstop. Colleagues whispered in frantic tones, desperate to know what I had done. "Emma, is it true? Did you really go to the SEC?" Some called in anger, others in awe, a few in trembling gratitude. I didn't answer most of them. I wasn't ready to defend myself in the court of gossip. The evidence would speak soon enough. That afternoon, I received an official letter from the company's legal department. In clipped formal language, it withdrew my termination notice. I was suddenly on administrative leave with full benefits pending review. The words made me laugh bitterly. Just 3 days earlier, they had thrown me out like garbage. Now faced with the storm, they wanted to pretend I was still one of them. I placed the letter on my kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about survival, theirs, not mine. They hoped that by restoring my status, they could soften the SEC, mitigate the damage, maybe even shift the story. But the story wasn't theirs to control anymore. By evening, a trusted friend still inside the company called me in hushed tones. "Emma, you wouldn't believe it. Executives are barricaded in their offices. The board has been in session for 6 hours. People are whispering that David is finished. They're terrified. Terrified." The word landed with a strange weight. I had once been terrified, too terrified of losing my pension, my reputation, my future. But as I listened to her voice, I realized something fear had shifted sides. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one living in its shadow. That night, I sat at my desk with a lamp burning low, the lockbox still beside me like an old friend. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock, and I thought about the path ahead. The investigation had only just begun. The company would fight back with everything it had. I would be smeared, attacked, called bitter and vengeful. But the evidence was stronger than any of their words. I looked at a photo of Elizabeth, my daughter, smiling under the bright sky at her college graduation. I thought of what she once told me, "You taught me strength." Mom, not with words, but with what you do. That was what kept me steady. I wasn't just fighting for a pension anymore. I was fighting for the principle that truth mattered. That integrity wasn't just a word in a company handbook. Now let me ask you, if you were me, would you have trusted the board's sudden change of heart? Would you have accepted their olive branch after they tried to erase you? Or would you have stood your ground and let the truth run its course? Leave your thoughts, because I know many of you have faced moments where trust was shattered, and I want to hear how you handled it. As midnight neared, the city outside felt restless like the calm before another storm. My phone buzzed again this time, with a message from someone I never expected, the chairman of the board himself. He wanted to meet. He wanted to talk. But I knew better. This wasn't about reconciliation. It was about desperation. And desperation makes powerful men dangerous. When the invitation came from the chairman of the board, I wasn't surprised. It was inevitable. They had tried to erase me with a signature, then bully me into silence with threats. Now, when neither had worked, they wanted me in their boardroom. But this time, I wouldn't be walking in alone. The next morning, my attorney Barbara Sharp, seasoned, unshakable, met me at the curb outside headquarters. The same building where only days earlier I had been escorted out by a security guard carrying my life in a cardboard box. Now I walked back in head high with Barbara at my side. Inside, the air was heavy electric. Employees lingered in the lobby, whispering their conversations, snapping to silence as we passed. The guard who had once held the door for me avoided my eyes, but his nod was softer this time, almost apologetic. Word had spread. The woman they had thrown away was now the center of the storm, threatening to swallow the company whole. We were led into the main boardroom. The long mahogany table gleamed under the recessed lights, but the people seated around it looked nothing like the confident executives I remembered. Their faces were drawn, their eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. And at the head of the table sat William Hargrove, the chairman himself, his voice thinner than I'd ever heard. When he said, "Miss Reynolds, thank you for coming." I didn't answer. Barbara placed her folder on the table, her presence commanding the room before a word was spoken. William cleared his throat. "We are aware of the concerns you have raised, and we want to assure you that the board has initiated a comprehensive internal review. Your termination has been rescinded, and your pension is intact. You remain an employee in good standing." The words were carefully chosen, rehearsed. I watched their faces as he spoke the way they avoided my eyes. It was not remorse. It was survival. Barbara leaned forward. "Let's be clear, Mr. Hargrove. Emma didn't suddenly raise concerns. She documented and reported them repeatedly over 4 years, and every single report was dismissed. The decision to terminate her 3 days before her pension vested speaks volumes about intent. You're only acting now because the SEC is involved." Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. One of the board members shifted in his seat. Another drummed nervous fingers against the table. "Yes, well," William stammered, "we are prepared to make amends. In fact, we would like to offer Miss Reynolds a consulting role after her retirement. We value her expertise, and we want her to help us design a new compliance program moving forward." It might have sounded generous to an outsider, but to me it was hollow. After years of ignoring me, silencing me, firing me, they wanted me back only because they needed my credibility. My presence could soften the headlines, reassure investors, slow the hemorrhage of their stock price. I spoke for the first time. My voice was steady, though my chest ached with the weight of it. For 29 years, I filed 47 reports documenting serious irregularities. I sent 16 memos addressing issues you are now pretending to discover. I requested 9 meetings with leadership, and only 2 were granted. Both times, nothing was done. Tell me, at what point in that history did you value my expertise? The silence in the room deepened, crushing. They couldn't answer. I continued leaning forward, so my words struck clean. "I will cooperate fully with both your internal investigation and the SEC, but I will speak only to the facts. Whether those facts protect or destroy this company depends not on me, but on what you choose to do next." Barbara rose, signaling the meeting was over. "We'll be in touch," she said briskly. As we walked out, I caught the expressions on their faces: fear, frustration, desperation. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, they were forced to look at me to see me not as an inconvenience, but as the truth they had spent years trying to bury. Outside in the sunlight, Barbara smiled faintly. That was perfectly stated. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours, the adrenaline that had carried me through draining from my body. My knees trembled, but my resolve held. This wasn't victory, not yet. It was only the first crack in a wall that had stood too long. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Barbara said, her eyes glinting, they scramble. "And you stand firm. They're terrified, Emma, not of you, but of the truth you carry. And that difference is why you will win." As we walked toward the street, I looked back at the building. I had once believed in it with everything I had, but now I saw it for what it was, a fortress built on lies already crumbling under its own weight. And I knew I was not done yet. 2 days after the boardroom confrontation, I found myself driving to the bank, a sealed envelope clutched tightly in my hand. For years, it had sat untouched in my safe deposit box, separated from the rest of my files. I had hidden it away, even from myself, convincing my mind it was only a precaution. But after the meeting with the board, I knew the time had come. Inside the bank's quiet vault room, I slid the envelope onto the table and broke the seal. The papers inside were older than most of what I had given to Gregory. Email exchanges between 2 board members and David's predecessor, discussing ways to smooth over financial appearances during a critical acquisition 5 years ago. The language was careful, but the intent was clear: manipulate the numbers to keep investors calm. My chest tightened as I reread the words. For years I had believed David was the cancer eating away at the company. But now I understood he wasn't the disease. He was only the latest symptom. The fraud went deeper, rooted in the very board that now sat across polished tables, pretending to be shocked. I called Gregory immediately. I found something else. something older. He listened as I explained, his voice grave when he finally replied, "Emma, this changes everything. If board members were complicit years before Langston, we're not looking at one bad executive. We're looking at systemic corruption." By Monday morning, the SEC team presented the new evidence to the board during a closed-door session. I wasn't inside, but Gregory called me afterward, his voice alive with tension. "It's chaos, Emma. 3 board members resigned on the spot. Others are scrambling to distance themselves. The narrative that this was just Langston's doing, it's gone. They're cornered." I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the phone long after the call ended. For so many years, I had been the voice no one heard, the reports no one read. Now suddenly, the entire company was unraveling, because the truth I had carried in silence was finally shouting for the world to hear. Still, the victory felt hollow. I thought back to the years I had trusted those very people. The executives who had smiled at me in hallways, praised my diligence in public meetings, only to bury my memos when no one was watching. They hadn't been blind, they had been complicit, and that realization cut deeper than David's smirk ever had. The company issued a press release by noon, a sweeping leadership restructuring cooperation with regulators' promises of reform. Carefully worded lines crafted by attorneys to calm the storm. But behind those words, I could see the truth. They weren't reforming because they had found their conscience. They were reforming because they had been caught. That night the phone rang again, this time from a reporter who had somehow found my number. He wanted my side of the story. He wanted me to go on record. I declined. This wasn't about headlines, it was about justice. The documents, the investigations, the charges, that was where the truth would live, not in sound bites. Still, I couldn't ignore the gnawing thought in the back of my mind. The deeper the investigation went, the more dangerous it would become. These weren't just careless errors. They were deliberate choices made at the highest levels of power. And powerful people rarely surrender without a fight. As I prepared for bed, I paused at the window, staring out at the darkened street. The house was quiet, but my thoughts were loud. I had forced the truth into the open. I had given the SEC the kind of evidence they couldn't ignore. But I knew what was coming next. Retaliation. They would not stop with resignation letters and press releases. They would find another way to protect themselves, to destroy me before the investigation could reach its conclusion. And that was the thought that followed me into restless sleep, that the war was far from over. 'Cause the twist that came next, even I didn't see it coming. Stay close. What happened in the days that followed will show just how ruthless people become when the truth threatens to strip away their power. By the end of that week, the storm had grown into a hurricane. What began as whispers about possible irregularities had exploded into a full-blown scandal plastered across every business outlet in the country. SEC investigation into Grantwell Manufacturing deepens, top executives under scrutiny, whistleblower at center of case. And in the middle of it all, my name was suddenly everywhere. On Friday morning, I woke to a call from Janet, her voice shaking. "Emma, it's over. They just announced it. David Langston has been terminated for cause." She paused as if bracing herself, then added, "And 4 board members resigned this morning. It's chaos here. People are cleaning out their offices like the building is on fire." I set the phone down slowly, staring at the walls of my kitchen. For months, even years, my warnings had been ignored. My memos had been treated like irritations. My voice had been silenced. And now, with the weight of undeniable evidence behind me, the same men who dismissed me were running for the exits. David's downfall came faster than I ever expected. One day he was strutting through the hallways, his tailored suit and smug grin radiating untouchable power. The next, he was escorted out by security, ironically, the same fate I had endured just days earlier. Only this time he carried no cardboard box, no plaque commemorating decades of service. He carried only disgrace. But if his removal felt inevitable, the resignations hit harder. William Hargrove, the chairman of the board, was gone. So were 3 other members who had signed off on the manipulated numbers. These were men who had spent years pretending not to see what lay in front of them. Men who smiled at company parties shaking hands while shareholders applauded false success. Now stripped of their titles, they looked less like titans of industry and more like frightened children caught with their hands in the jar. The company tried to contain the damage with yet another statement: leadership restructuring, commitment to transparency, moving forward with integrity. The words were polished but empty. The stock dropped another 12% that afternoon. Investors were furious. Employees were terrified. And for the first time in 3 decades, the company was being forced to face the very truth it had tried to bury. I should have felt vindicated, triumphant, even. Instead, what I felt was heavier, more complicated. I thought of the nights I stayed late combing through numbers, believing I was protecting something worth saving. I thought of my husband's voice telling me not to bend, not to break. I thought of my daughter who had grown up watching me choose duty over dinners, truth over comfort. And I realized this wasn't just about revenge. It was about survival. It was about teaching the people who had dismissed me that integrity doesn't vanish just because it is inconvenient. The calls from journalists grew relentless. Some painted me as a hero, others questioned my motives. And yes, David fought back in the only way he knew, by attacking me publicly. He gave interviews claiming I was bitter, that I had performance issues, that I had been passed over for promotions, and wanted to get even. I read his words in silence, the sting sharp but fleeting. Lies were his last defense. But I knew the truth, and so did the investigators who now had thousands of pages proving him wrong. That weekend, I sat by the lake near my home, the ripples stretching endlessly across the water. For the first time in years, I let myself breathe. The company had tried to erase me. Instead, it was erasing itself, one resignation, one headline, one truth at a time. But even then, I knew this wasn't over. The investigation was still unfolding. Charges were still possible. More truths were still buried, waiting to surface. And I would be there ready when they did. Now let me ask you something. If you were standing in my shoes watching the people who silenced you finally fall, would you have felt satisfaction? Or would you have felt what I did, a strange mix of relief, sorrow, and grim determination? Tell me in the comments, and if you haven't already, join this community by subscribing. Because the fight doesn't end here. And trust me, the next chapter will leave you speechless. The storm had broken wide open, but justice that was still on the horizon. 6 months later, I found myself in a federal courtroom, the air heavy with tension. The wood-paneled walls, the quiet shuffling of papers, the low murmur of attorneys, it all felt surreal. After nearly 3 decades of working in compliance, of documenting every irregularity I could find, I was no longer just the officer with red ink notes and ignored memos. I was the whistleblower, the witness, the reason this case existed. At the defense table sat David Langston, the man who had looked me in the eye and told me my career was over 3 days before my pension vested. But the arrogance was gone. He sat hunched in his dark suit. His once proud posture diminished, his face pale under the courtroom lights. Next to him were 2 former board members, their expensive attorneys, whispering frantically in their ears. When the judge entered, the room stilled. One by one, the defendants rose, and one by one, they entered guilty pleas. Securities fraud, systematic financial manipulation, lies that had inflated the company's value, deceived investors, and endangered livelihoods. The words rang in my ears, sharp and final. It should have felt like victory. In many ways it was. The man who had so casually discarded me was now branded guilty, his empire of shortcuts and lies collapsing around him. The board members who had pretended not to see the rot were finally being held accountable. Justice, long delayed, was finally being delivered. But as I sat there, my hands folded tightly in my lap, I didn't feel triumph. I felt weary. Weary of the years I had spent shouting into silence. Weary of the sacrifices I had made, the family moments I had missed, the long nights I had endured. Weary that it had taken this much this far for the truth to matter. After court adjourned, reporters swarmed the steps outside. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, questions fired from every direction. Emma, do you feel vindicated? Emma, was it worth it? Emma, do you have any regrets? I didn't stop. I didn't answer. The truth was, none of those questions could be answered in a soundbite. What I felt wasn't simple. What I had lived wasn't tidy. Still, the practical outcomes were undeniable. My pension had been reinstated, every cent I had earned secured. The company, desperate to limit further damage, offered a compensation package equal to 5 years of my salary plus lifetime healthcare coverage. On top of that, the SEC awarded me a whistleblower payment, 15% of the penalties assessed against Grantwell Manufacturing. It was more money than I had ever imagined, having a safety I had once thought was gone forever. I used part of it to establish a scholarship fund in my husband's name, dedicated to women pursuing careers in corporate ethics and compliance. It felt right, as if all those years of being dismissed could now transform into opportunities for others who might one day face the same silence I had. The rest I used to buy a small home by the lake, a place where my daughter Elizabeth and my grandchildren could visit on weekends, a place where laughter replaced the endless shuffle of paperwork, a place where I could breathe. But the fight had left its mark on me. I turned down the company's offer to return as a consultant. I couldn't bring myself to walk back into those halls, not after what I had seen behind the polished glass and polished smiles. Instead, I chose to work directly with regulators, helping them design stronger whistleblower protocols, ensuring no one else would endure what I had. David and the others faced sentencing later that year. When I saw him escorted from the courtroom for the final time, his shoulders slumped and his future in ruins, I felt no joy. What I saw in his eyes wasn't hatred or even recognition. It was emptiness. A man who had gambled on greed and lost everything. I turned away not because I couldn't look, but because I no longer needed to. His story was over. Mine was not. Justice had been served, but for me it was never about revenge. It was about proving that integrity can withstand even the most ruthless attempts to silence it. And as I drove home that evening, the lake glowing in the fading light, I whispered to myself the truth. I had always believed, the truth that had carried me through every lonely night with a pen in my hand and a memo no one would read. The facts never change, and in the end, the facts will always win. The months after the trial unfolded slowly, like a long exhale after years of holding my breath. For the first time in decades, I woke each morning without the weight of deadlines or memos pressing on my chest. The company that had defined nearly my entire adult life was no longer the axis of my existence. Instead, my world had narrowed into something smaller, quieter, and infinitely more precious. Elizabeth moved back to St. Paul to be closer to me. She brought her 2 children, and suddenly my weekends were filled with laughter instead of silence. We would sit on the porch of my new lakeside home, the children skipping rocks across the water, while Elizabeth teased me for the way I still folded laundry with military precision. Some habits die hard, she'd laugh, and she was right. But for once, I wasn't apologizing for who I was. The scholarship fund in Thomas's name grew faster than I had expected. Letters began arriving from young women across the country, students who dreamed of working in compliance, of building careers in ethics, of doing the kind of work that had nearly broken me, but also defined me. Their words humbled me. They called me an example, a guide. I had never thought of myself as either. I was just someone who had refused to look away. Yet, even in peace, the echoes of the past lingered. Each year, the company still sent me its annual report, perhaps out of obligation, perhaps as apology. I would sit with a cup of coffee and read through the numbers, my old instincts flaring as I checked for irregularities. But the reports looked different now, cleaner, sharper, less glossy. For the first time, I believed they might actually be telling the truth. Maybe in some strange way, my fight had forced them to change. One evening, Elizabeth asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Mom, do you regret it? Staying there all those years knowing how it ended?" I thought about it for a long time. About the recitals I had missed, the vacations cut short, the endless nights I had poured into a company that betrayed me. And then I thought about the courtroom, the guilty pleas, the scholarship fund, the letters from women I had never met. No, I said finally. I don't regret the work. I regret that it ended the way it did. But integrity isn't just about being honest when it's easy. It's about holding to your principles when it costs you something. And in the end, that's what mattered. Elizabeth nodded, her eyes soft, her children playing at her feet. You taught me that, she said, not with words, but with the way I had lived. That more than the pension, more than the settlement, more than the headlines, was the legacy I cared about. That my daughter, and maybe her children after her, would understand that truth is not negotiable. As the sun set over the lake painting, the water in shades of gold, I realized something. This wasn't a story about revenge. It never had been. It was a story about standing firm when the ground shakes beneath you, about refusing to trade silence for security, about believing that even when everyone else looks away, the facts will remain. And I want to leave you with this. If you've ever been told to stay quiet, to keep your head down, to accept less than you deserve, don't. Your story matters. Your truth matters. And if you need to hear more stories like this, make sure you subscribe and watch the next video, because I promise, the fight for integrity isn't mine alone. It belongs to all of us. I sat back in my chair listening to the laughter of my grandchildren, the gentle lapping of water against the shore, and the steady beat of my own heart. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for the next battle. I was simply living. The company had tried to silence me. Instead, it had given me a voice louder than I ever imagined. And that voice I knew would not fade. Life has a way of surprising us. For nearly 3 decades, I thought my story would end in a quiet retirement party, a cake shared in the break room, and a pension check that reflected my years of service. Instead, it ended in headlines, courtrooms, and a fight that tested every ounce of resolve I had. But here's the truth, sometimes the ending we don't expect is the one we need most. When I look back now, sitting on my porch as the lake turns silver under the evening sky, I realize the battle wasn't about a paycheck. It wasn't even about the betrayal of one man or one board. It was about proving to myself and to my daughter that integrity is not something you compromise. That no matter how many doors slam in your face, the truth has a way of finding light. I think about Thomas, my late husband, who always told me my attention to detail was a gift, not a burden. He never lived to see what that gift would uncover, but I like to believe he would be proud. And I think about Elizabeth, whose children now run across my yard, with the kind of joy I once feared I could never give them. Their laughter is the real pension I was fighting for, the legacy that will last longer than any company. The company survived, though, forever changed. I survived too, bruised but unbroken. And as the sun dips below the horizon, I know this much for certain: the facts never change. People may lie, institutions may crumble, but truth will always remain. And that in the end is the freedom I fought for.